Hello, my name is Raquel Martinez, and I am presenting cholera for Dr. Cody's microbiology class. Cholera's formal name is Vibrio cholerae, and this is an image of the bacteria itself. Cholera is an acute diarrheal illness caused by infection of the intestine with the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. And the following is the taxonomy. They are from the domain bacteria. Their genus is Vibrio, and their species is Vibrio cholerae. And this is a picture of cholera itself. Characteristics of cholera bacteria. There are more than 200 serogroups. However, only 2 of the serogroups cause the disease cholera, and these are 01 and 0139, which are related also to the cholera epidemics. Occasionally, there are sporadic cases with other serogroups, but these don't spread in epidemic forms. They just cause inflammation in the stomach most of the time. Characteristics of the bacteria are that they are gram-negative, they are rod-shaped, they have polar flagella, and the incubation period is of 12 hours to 4.5 days. So a little bit about cholera's history. The first recorded account was in 1543, and the locals called it morexi, and apparently it was very, very deadly, and they recorded that the victims died 8 hours after they started showing symptoms. Also, the fatality rate was so high that they had a hard time burying all the people that were dying all at once. Also, in the early 19th century, they thought the cause of cholera was the bad odors coming from sewages or from open tombs. But later, in 1855, John Snow, this guy, made the discovery that it could not be the cholera could not be caused by bad odors because the disease manifested itself not in the respiratory system but in the digestive system. And he mapped out an outbreak in London and found that the water pump was the epicenter of the outbreak, therefore connecting that the water was contaminated, therefore the cause of the outbreak. In 1854, Filippo Pacini, which is this guy, described the microorganism and published an article about it. In 1884, Robert Koch, this man, isolated the bacteria and explained how it was spread. Since then, there's only been 7 global pandemics, and each year cholera affects 1.3 to 4 million people, killing 21,000 to 143,000 people a year. Forms of transmission. So cholera is transmitted by fecal-oral route, which means you have to ingest the infected feces, in order to be contaminated or to get cholera. Usually, epidemics come from contamination of the water source, where feces enters the water that people use to drink, and therefore contaminates that whole entire population. Here on the right are examples of how the contaminated feces can be transmitted or can get to a person's mouth system, and it is usually through the food that people eat being touched by flies which have touched the feces before, or again, like I said, feces entering water sources, or again, not washing hands after using the restroom, which can all lead to ingesting contaminated feces. People are infectious while symptomatic and a few days after recovery, although there are some people that are called the carriers, which can carry the bacteria and be asymptomatic. And what's weird about this is that they carry the bacteria for months or even years and are able to infect other people if their feces ends up in being ingested. Also, this bacteria, since it lives in water, it can people are contaminated when eating raw or undercooked seafood. The bacteria actually can survive in a wide variety of foods and drinks, 1 to 14 days in room temperature and 1 to 35 days in ice. Symptoms for cholera, which are diarrhea, which is usually called the rice water stool diarrhea, and vomiting and abdominal cramping, and hypovolemic shock, which means that your body has lost more than 20% of its water. Therefore, the heart is having a hard time pumping blood. What I found very interesting is that only 1 in 20 people infected developed the cholera symptoms or the cholera disease. And the reason for that is because that the acid in our stomach is usually able to fight the cholera bacteria. Most people that ingest the cholera bacteria are asymptomatic or have gastroenteritis, which is just inflammation. And if the person actually gets the cholera disease, signs of dehydration include loss of skin turgor, dry mucus, membranes, and hypotension and thirst. And in order to diagnose cholera, they take a sample of your stool, and then they take it to the lab and see if the bacteria is the 01 or 0139 strand. So how does the bacteria attack our body? So the bacteria colonizes in the small intestine, and then it secretes the CT, which is a cholera enterotoxin, and which is this. And the cholera toxin has a subunit B, which then is able to bind to the receptor of the epithelial cell, GM1, causing endocytosis of the toxin. The toxin then enters the cytosol, where the G protein is activated. After the G protein is activated, CAMP, which is cyclic adenosine 5 monophosphate, is produced in large amounts, and that activates the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. And after that has been activated, massive secretions of electrolytes and water is released into the intestinal lumen, which causes the diarrhea. So who is most susceptible to this disease? And that is usually older people or children, also specifically immunocompromised people that do not have the enough acid in their stomach to combat the bacteria when it enters their system. And what happens after you recover from the disease? So you're not completely immune after it. Yes, your body, since it's produced antibodies, it is now more resistant to a reinfection. But it is not. These antibodies do not fight against the other strand of cholera. Also, it is also seen that for women, it is best that they breastfeed their children, because then they can pass the antibodies to their children, and they can be resistant to the bacteria as long as they are breastfeeding. So how is it treated? Usually the best way to treat cholera is through a rehydration treatment, which is just a mixture of water, salt, and sugar. And if this is not done, the patient can actually die within hours because they're losing so much water very quickly. There is also a vaccine which is made up of inactivated host cell V. cholerae, but it is not it's not really recommended because it only provides 50% protection for about 6 months. Sometimes it's a little longer for adults, but for some reason, each website I read, it said they didn't really recommend a vaccine. I mean, unless you're traveling and you're immunodeficient, and so then they do recommend the vaccine. Also, if a person is extremely dehydrated, intravenous fluid, so that the hydration process can be faster. There are antibiotics, but those can shorten the duration of diarrhea, but they don't really help very much. And zinc supplements have been found to also decrease the duration of diarrhea for children, but they usually just concentrate in the rehydration treatment of water mixed with salt and sugar. A way to prevent cholera could be just washing hands often and cooking food well, and covering it up so that flies don't get on it, maybe getting the vaccine, and drinking and using water safely. Thank you very much. These are my citations, and if you have any questions, you can ask them in class. Thank you.